The months of October and November have a strange and wonderful quality here in North Carolina. It's definitely the end of summer now, just when summer was starting to feel really good. The humidity was lower, the sunshine became softer, the beaches emptied up, and then all of a sudden things start to change. The leaves are falling and we're getting ready for winter. And life is like that sometimes too, I think. Just when things were starting to feel right, everything changes. The job gets easier, just as we learned what we were doing. And then all of a sudden we've got new management, new technology, new policies and procedures, or the children are growing and becoming less teenagey, angsty, and then they decide it's time to leave home. Or, the mortgage is finally paid off and we have the money in our pockets to take that big hiking trip through Ireland that we've looked forward to, and now we find our knees are too stiff to do much hiking. So there's always change. It's been said a lot that Americans tend to thrive on change, that we like to keep moving, most often seeing changes as being some sort of progress. Back in the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville marveled at this, and he wrote at that time in his journal, and I'm going to apologize for using the exclusively the masculine when I use his quote, but he wrote, "The American has no time to tie himself to anything. He grows accustomed only to change and ends by regarding it as the natural state of man. He feels the need of it, more he loves it, for the instability, instead of meaning disaster for him, seems to give birth only to miracles all around him." But as I read that, I wonder, are we really all that comfortable with change? I'm not so sure. I'm thinking about your story, Ken, and how that the story of the shootings had such a short life cycle in the news. And I think it's probably because we don't like change, we like stability. And those short news cycles of those kinds of changes disappear early because we want to get back to that sense of having a more stable environment. I'm thinking about the elections coming up next Tuesday and how anxious many of us are about thinking about the changes that those might bring. And I've been recently working on a certification to do some couples counseling. And I find that one of the most anxiety-producing things for couples is when one of the people is going through some major changes of some sort. And there's this sense that the partner wants to change them back to who they were. For purposes of my reflections this morning, though, I want to make a distinction between change and transition, because I see changes as being something that happens on the outside of us that impacts our lives, and a transition as being something that happens inside of us that then often impacts our outside lives. And the reason I'm making this distinction is that I find that transitions, those things that happen within us that change the way we perceive ourselves or the way we see something in the outside world, is a more spiritual process than actually something that's just happening outside of us that's impacting us. So let's say, for example, You moved to Raleigh from upstate New York, and you've got this house now in Raleigh, but you're still kind of feeling like an upstate New Yorker, right? You're really missing that coffee shop that you left and the people that you left. So you've made a change, but you haven't really made a transition yet. Or let's say, on the other hand, that you still have the same job, but suddenly you're not feeling quite so passionate about it, and you can't really quite figure out why. You are starting to make a transition, but you haven't yet made a change. So change and transition often go together, but not necessarily. So this morning, as I focus on transitions, those spiritual feelings, kind of often disturbing feelings that we might have that something needs to move or change in our outside lives, they're much more time consuming than what we would often like to see, right? And because it's true, what often happens is when people are feeling the need for an inside transition, they shortchange that process by making a change. This is kind of the joke about midlife, the person who buys the convertible because they can't really quite deal with what's happening inside. And so they make a change of buying something new that makes them feel younger. Carl Jung, many years ago, stressed that we make major transitions, not changes, but transitions in our lives about every 21 years, 20 or 21 years. So, when we're a 21-year-old, a 42-year-old, a 63-year-old, or thereabouts, we're going to be inside we're going to start making a major transition. And it's also been said that about every 7 years, we need to make an internal transition. So, 3 small transitional times for every major one. And in passages, Gail Sheehy describes what she calls the predictable crises of adult life. So there's a lot of research out there about these kinds of internal transitions. But I find that, in fact, every lifetime has its own unique rhythm. Each life unfolds its promise in kind of an unpredictable, alternating rhythm of contraction and expansion, of confusion and stability, so that we don't really grow as individuals in one linear line. We grow as individuals in these cycles of confusion and stability. And often these kinds of transitions will accumulate slowly, and then a change needs to be made. So it's much like nature, where you see the leaves kind of turning color slowly, 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 and then all of a sudden they drop. Or ice is slowly, slowly melting, and then all of a sudden you see the river break through, right? So some examples might be, where the middle-aged woman has been thinking about doing something different for years and years, and all of a sudden she goes back to graduate school. Or the businessman has been thinking for years about leaving work, and all of a sudden he does it to rejoin the Peace Corps. So, transition happens internally, and then there's often a burst of energy around making a change. So these kinds of internal transitions have a huge impact on our relationships and on our work lives Imagine for a moment a whole office full of people who are in the midst of these different cycles, right? Of contraction, expansion, confusion, stability, or a family of 4, each member being in motion of going through these cycles of being confused and then being sure about what they want to do next. It can be very confusing and very anxiety producing. There are a couple of important things to remember about transitions that happen from the inside out. First, they are our natural way, as I said, for human beings to grow, and that our culture places a lot of barriers on this kind of cyclic growth spurts that we go through. We place so much emphasis on monetary gain and professional expertise in this country that if we take a break to figure out what we want to do next, we're seen as kind of a failure, right? So there are a lot of barriers to this natural progress of personal growth. And then the second thing that's important to remember is that in this transitional process, the cycle always begins with an ending to something. Always begins with an ending. And to transition with grace, you need to respect the ending, and you need to have a certain time of what I call the neutral zone, where there's not a lot of activity taking place, and then finally there's a new beginning. So let's say you're somebody going through a transition, or something is beginning to tickle at your subconscious, and one of the first clues may be that you're feeling disengaged with something. Disengagement is usually the first step to a new beginning. Whether that's work or what you're doing in the world or how you're seeing yourself in the world, begins to change, and there's a chipping away of the context within which you see your life. So there's disengagement, and then there's a dismantling of some way that you saw yourself. I'm thinking my last big transition was when I started realizing that it was time for me to leave parish ministry, and I had to start some dismantling of what that looked like, giving up my roles and my robes. And then a disidentification with that role. Sometimes there's disenchantment because new beginnings might happen because there's been some sort of betrayal or some way in which the world was not as forgiving as you thought it was going to be in some way. And then finally, there's disorientation, which is the confusion that comes at the very end of that end. A resistance to transition of this kind of personal growth is often because we fear this emptiness and this confusion and this vulnerability that brings. And people around us might try to encourage us to be our former selves because they see this confusion and they see this anxiety that comes at this stage. And you might be tempted yourself to return to your old self because it's hard to trust yourself when you're feeling really lost and confused, right? But if you take that advice and you try to return to your old ways, you're going to short circuit that process. And you might miss an opportunity for your personal growth. the next thing that's going to happen is you'll enter this neutral zone. And the neutral zone is a time when you're no longer the person you were, but you haven't quite become the person that you might become in some way. You want to make progress because this space is really, really uncomfortable, but the neutral zone takes as long as it takes. When I read scripture, I am always taken aback by the rich wilderness stories that are in the Old Testament and New Testament, particularly in the Christian scriptures. I'm thinking about the 40 days that the Israelites spent in the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. 40 years it took them to travel, what was it, 50 miles or something? Just a very short distance. What they were actually doing was spending time in the neutral zone where they shifted from being slaves to being a people, a community. And then there's also the wilderness story of Jesus as he goes into the wilderness for 40 days to determine what his ministry is going to look like and what his life is going to look like moving forward. If you read these texts, it's important to remember that the word wilderness can also be transcribed as sanctuary and sometimes even as holy ground. So you're standing on holy ground when you're in the neutral zone. This is where the transition is actually going to be taking place in this unproductive time when you're watching for messages from your dreams, watching for synchronicities, other things that might tell you where you're heading. And then when that's done, finally, you're ready for a new beginning. And when you're ready, when that neutral zone has done its work, there will be doors that open for you to give you the new beginning that's been waiting for you during that time. Here's a checklist of things to consider when you're going through these 3 phases of ending, neutral zone, and beginning. At the very beginning, if you're feeling like you are, that transition is tickling at your subconscious, ask yourself, what is it time to let go of? This is the most important question. And not things out there, but in here. Because remember, a transition is what happens inside of us, not in the outer world. So what do you need to let go of about the way that you have been seeing yourself as part of the family of the world? Don't jump to changing things around you yet. Instead, consider what it is about you that is no longer serving you. And grieve the loss of that person that you are no longer going to be. Even if it's a positive transition, it's important to grieve who you're not going to be anymore, because that person really served you well for a number of years. If this transition that you're going through is not of your own choosing, it might be a good time to remember other transitions you've been through and what kinds of opportunities arose as a result of that ending, because every ending does have a new beginning. And then as you enter that neutral zone, take your time, because remember, you're on holy ground and this is where the work takes place. Find someone to talk to, either a professional or a trusted friend, someone who is probably outside your family, because families are often disrupted by this process. So you find a trusted friend who is short on advice and long on just listening to the confusion that you're feeling. And make sure that you take some time to carve out some time to be alone. And time alone, not with a good book, but time alone to just be alone. And although this wilderness time is going to be confusing, try to think of this transition as a time of leaving the status quo, being in fertile timeout for a while, and then coming back with an answer. And finally, ask yourself often during that neutral zone time, what is waiting for me now? What is waiting for me? Much as we would love to have someone tell us what's waiting for us, that answer needs to come from deep within. And then when the time is right, that knowing will come. So that's a checklist for you if you're going through that transition. If you have a loved one going through that transition, that can be a really scary time. But please try to be patient with them because they're in a very vulnerable place. Listen as much as possible. Try not to be anxious. Try not to ask what's going on because it's very likely they won't be able to tell you. Remember that all relationships are structured through a web of unspoken agreements, and all of those agreements get disturbed when one of the partners is going through a transition. Try to remember that this is a natural, inevitable, and even expected part of being in relationship with another person, if it's a long-term relationship. Your roles and your responsibilities may need to be renegotiated, but that often happens after the transition has happened, when that person knows the shape of what they want their life to look like. And then you can begin renegotiating what your relationship looks like. We enter into this life fully and gracefully by moving through cycles of transition with love and with intention. I want you to take a deep breath in with me and think about the fact that the air that you hold in your body is the most precious thing in the world, and your very life depends on it. But you cannot hold it. It has to be expelled again. If you try to hold it, you'll strangle. So it is with the selves that we have been in the past, often. Precious as they may be, sometimes those selves need to be let go. They need to be released in order that we can live our fullest lives. May each of you open your hearts to what is waiting to be fulfilled in your lives and through your lives. May your endings be graceful, and may your beginnings bring you much joy. Amen, and blessed be.